Hey, in this video I'm showing you how I made a close-up pad for magicians using contrasting hardwoods. I started off with 4 scrap pieces of walnut left over from other projects. The frame dimensions of this pad are approximately 17.5 inches by 12.5 inches by 13/16 of an inch. With the 4 pieces cut to width, we can now cut the miters to length. For the highest precision, I used a double square, a marking knife, and a steel ruler to mark out the miters. The use of a miter sled makes for perfect 90-degree corners. I'll post YouTube links below as to where I learned how to make this jig and all other jigs in this video. With all 4 pieces at their final dimensions, it was now time for the glue up. To help with this, I used a tie-down strap and some web clamp corners to make for even pressure around the frame. Although miter joints look nice, they're not the strongest type of joinery. I used my spline jig to cut slots into each of the 4 corners so that I could later insert splines to strengthen the connections. Now time to cut the splines. The idea here is to cut a thin piece of wood to the exact thickness of your table saw blade. To do this, I took 2 pieces of maple and cut them to the exact same width. Then, without changing the fence, I butt them up together and passed them through again, but stopping just a few inches from the end. I then turned the piece over that has the unfinished cut and put it up against the fence. By positioning the other piece up against the notch and passing it through the saw again, we're left with a thin piece of wood being the exact thickness of the table saw blade. I'll post a YouTube video below as to where I learned how to do this in much more detail. With the splines cut to length, they can now be glued into the slots at each corner. Once dry, I brought the frame over to the vise and used a flush cutting saw to cut the splines flush to the frame. It's now time to put a radius on the outside corners. I used a 1/2 inch outer radius jig to mark the lines, then used a bench sander to remove the majority of the material. Moving over to the router table, I used the outer radius jig as a guide and made the final cut with a flush trim router bit, making for the perfect 1/2 inch radius. Switching over to a 1/4 inch roundover bit, I put another radius around the perimeter of the top side of the frame, which now looks a little something like this. Changing the bit again to a 1/2 inch rabbiting bit, I cut a rabbet along the inside perimeter of both the top and bottom of the frame, making sure the height of the bit matches the thickness of the inserts that we're making next. Just to recap, we have a 1/2 inch radius at all 4 corners, a 1/4 inch radius around the perimeter of the top, and a rabbet along the inside perimeter of both the top and bottom, which essentially leaves a lip around the middle. It's now time for the bottom insert. I used a crosscut sled to make a perfectly square cut on some 1/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. Then cut it to match the inside dimensions of the frame. I used the 1/2 inch radius jig again to match the inside corners and proceeded to round them out using the same method as before. With just a little bit of sanding, it was the perfect fit. Popping it back out, I spread a bead of glue around and put it back in to dry. The top insert was made the exact same way, only 3/32 of an inch smaller at each dimension to allow for the thickness of the velvet to be wrapped around the edges. I also sanded away the sharp edge so that it wouldn't cut into the velvet over time. Next was cutting some high density 1/2 inch foam to the exact same size as the insert. For this pad, I used red crushed velvet and cut it to size, leaving an extra 1.5 inches all the way around. Layering the foam and plywood over the velvet, I wrapped the edges around and fastened with 1/4 inch staples. The corners are a bit tricky. I'll post another video below where it shows how to fold them nicely. A quick pass with the hammer made sure the staples were fully embedded. Moving back to the frame, I glued little filler blocks at each of the 4 corners that were the same thickness of the lip of the frame. These blocks provide material for the screws to go into when fastening the feet. After pre-drilling the holes, it was almost time to start sanding, but first there was a few imperfections that I wanted to fix. It's difficult to see on camera, but there is a little bit of a gap where one of the splines were, and also a tiny gap where the birch meets the walnut on the bottom. To fix this, I made my own wood filler consisting of glue, a little bit of water, and some sawdust to match the color as best as possible. From my experience when working with wood filler is that you can always sand away the excess, but it will never stain the same because it gets embedded into the wood fibers. For the best results, I used masking tape to make sure the wood filler would only go where needed. Finally, for some sanding. A quick little tip, never go more than twice your grit for each pass. I started at 100, then again at 150, and the final pass was at 220 grit. Getting close to completion, I mixed up some Rubio monocoat with some hardener and applied the finishing oil. After buffing it out, it was probably the most satisfying part of the project. After that dried, I popped in the insert with the pad, and all that was left was to screw on the feet. These feet are made from polylastomer. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. They don't stain or mark any surfaces, and they provide a lot more grip than your typical rubber feet. The nice thing about the design of this pad is that the screws that hold the feet also secure the top insert into position. So if you ever damage the velvet, it could be replaced simply by removing the screws. And there you have it, a close-up pad made from walnut, birch, and maple. Close-up pads like this, as well as other Magic products, are available at artisanshop.ca. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, leave a comment, and consider subscribing.